Well, weather has been the focal point of this year's planting season for corn and soybeans. Some of the quotes this week were, "Gotta have a week of good weather before we see the fields again." And heard another one, "It'll be interesting to see the impact on emergence for the crops that got planted over the last week or so." And they were referring to the amount of water and how soggy the soils were. So we'll talk about that and the impact of weather news on the grain market. That's coming up straight ahead with Kohli and Cavanaugh. The guys are brought to you each week by the Allen County Farm Bureau. And like we always say, the Farm Bureau is on duty 24/7, 365 days a year. They're looking out for the interests of Hoosier farm families every day, from local and state issues all the way to Capitol Hill. Your membership supports all of that, so consider becoming a member. Go online to itpaystobeamember.org. Well, we go to our team weather watcher, David Kohli, for this one. David, the weather this past week has just been crazy, and that's why all these people are talking about wondering about emergence and when we're going to get in the field again, because I think a point that you were making to me in a conversation was it seems like there's been one storm after another.
And there's more being forecast because my wife and I were watching Ryan Hall, our favorite weather forecaster, on YouTube. He lowered the boom on everybody. He said it's going to be rainy till the end of the month of May. He's going to be storm after storm after storm. See what happened to Houston. He talked about that on Wednesdays. And Houston got hit with 80-mile-an-hour winds. And why are we getting all this severe weather all the time? Well, it's a lot about to do with the solar activity. That's right. If you saw the Aurora Borealis.
Here we go again, the sun man.
Of course. I'm going to be the sun guy. Because I'll tell you, GPSs on tractors have been failing because of the solar activity. The solar wind actually pushes. It's so great of a wind, actually pushes space vessels in space. And this solar wind hitting us changes the weather for us because we've got really strong magnetic lines of flux, but the solar wind hitting us makes it go wonko, wonko, wonko. So you don't get the good TV signals you want to get or the radio signals or even the telephone signals on your cell phone. So there's a lot of issues here dealing with the weather changing because of solar activity, John.
Well, David, I'm not going to totally disagree with that, but I think you might be getting a little bit carried away with it because specifically you talk about Houston and the Southwest. Okay, how does that compare with what's going on in the Midwest? When it comes to planting, last week we were behind, but not by very much. We were just slightly behind. Corn was 49% planted in the U.S., and beans were at 35% planted. And actually in Indiana, bean planting was slightly ahead of normal. And corn was only a little bit behind normal. And I know this past week we had rain here and there, but the other side of it is, some areas got a lot of rain, other areas got very little rain. Some people made pretty good progress this week. I don't see a major concern. It could happen. Obviously, we are now in the crunch period. This is May the 18th, and we have to really be concerned over the next 2 weeks. And I don't like the forecast for the 6 to 10 and the 11 to 15-day forecast. They are calling for above average rain. I'm not concerned yet, but if that comes and it slows things down, then we've got a problem.
Well, the comments from Ryan were that these storms are going to start moving further north and just giving everybody across the Midwest rain. Even driest areas are going to be getting it. Yesterday on Twitter, Arlen Suderman says, okay, if you want to see the planting progress, look at the corn. Now, we are below last year, 2023, and we're above 2019, which was a really dry year, but we're right in the middle of the two of them. So, yes, it's a patchwork quilt, guys, because some areas are getting rain and some areas aren't getting it. It's not the best weather season so far.
Yeah, well, and that's the point right there, I think. And to John's point as well, and I've talked to a number of farmers around the region as well, and some have been flooded and some have not. Some have gotten a lot of stuff done. So I think the concern is about how random it's been. That's the bottom line. But real quick, wonka, wonka, wonka. Is that like a scientific term, Kohli, or what? Where'd
that come from, David?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That doesn't sound scientific to me. Anyway, let's talk about export sales this week because export sales were almost as bad as some of the weather that we've had around here. Although, well, David, give us some numbers, and then we'll talk about these flash sales we got this week.
Rob, what you've got to talk about is the numbers are all totaled are really low. Like wheat's only 382, corn 742, beans are 265. But what I find is really interesting is Mexico bought 604,000 tons of wheat. Mexico bought 372,000 tons of corn, and 241,000 tons went to Japan. So you are seeing some countries buying an awful lot of grain from us, and that is not really entering into people's thoughts because all they look are at the totals. They don't look at the individual countries that are buying this stuff.
They're so focused on China. Well,
yes.
Oddly, flash sale this week of 180,000 tons of soybeans for delivery to unknown, and everybody instantly says, oh, that must be China. Well, speaking of China,
Right.
the problem there, John Cavanaugh, is Biden announced steep tariff increases on Chinese imports. And that just ends up, stirring the pot all over again, John.
Does that got something to do with politics, you think?
Let me think.
Yeah, Biden administration has announced tariffs on EVs, the electric vehicles, solar panels, semiconductors, and many other different things. And I'm a free trade believer. I don't like this. And right off the bat, the Chinese have threatened to put a 25% import tariff on U.S. soybeans. So here we go again with a trade war.
Yeah.
But there is one thing that does bother me. We have a trade deficit with China. Specifically in 2023, China sold us goods with a value of $484 billion. We sold them goods with a total value of $148 billion.
Ouch.
That's a huge trade deficit.
Yep.
What do you think?
Well, you got to go to the corn chart and the bean chart. When the beans exploded up 2 days ago, they went right to the 20-day moving average. But the next day, we exploded through the moving average, but sold off toward the middle. But then Friday, we've got the market coming back up on the beans, not the corn and wheat. So this is very, very strong as far as technical traders are concerned. Now, wheat did sell off after last night's rally because we did see Ukraine putting up some drones that attacked Russian bases and Russian vessels. So wheat went up at first, but then it sold off because they said, well, that's not going to make that much difference because they did get some rain out west in the driest areas because of that Houston rain I was talking about. And pulling corn out because wheat's a feed too.
Oh, absolutely. It competes with corn, of course, when it comes to feeding. Of course, Kansas is our largest wheat producer, but they did a wheat tour this past week at Kansas, and frankly, the results were better than expected. They project the average yield in Kansas at 46.5 bushels per acre, better than the 5-year average of 42.4, well above last year, but last year was a terrible year, but better than expected. Apparently, that crop did not get hurt as badly with the dry weather this past winter as some people thought.
Speaking of foreign countries and how that impacts our grain markets, David Konab, Brazil's export agency raised their estimates for soybean production from 146.5 to 147.7 million tons, and that's even after the recent flooding. Still, there's like 20% of the Rio Grande do Sul crop left in the field unharvested. I looked at this and I hearkened back to something that you've talked about. How much of this is controlling the narrative?
Yes, it's the old thought. And I've been in these markets, since the early 70s. And it's the old quote, rain makes grain. And I'm thinking, in the 90s, the same thing happened. We had all the rain across the Midwest in the 90s, remember? And they shut down the Missouri River, shut down the Mississippi River because they were overwhelming and the levees were failing. Rain doesn't always make grain when it's excessive.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing is so many of these areas are getting hit with excessive amounts of rainfall, and that's going to be hurting the production because when you see the pictures from Rio Grande do Sul with the flooded areas they're showing, it's awful.
The highest amount of rain since the 30s or something like that, since 1936 or something. But what's the real impact? I mean, USDA is still at 154 on production from Brazil, and everybody else is around 147 or 148, somewhere in there. But I think that's built into the market today. I don't think the market's trading the USDA number. I think they're trading those lower numbers. The flooding in Brazil is obvious. It's bad, it's severe.
Well, and how can you come up with the final number when you've got 20% of the crop that's sitting out there underwater? You don't know how badly it's going to be damaged until you start harvesting it, and you're going to have to see a lot of recession of water on those fields before you're ever going to be able to get to them. All right, one quick thing, John, and that is that crush number. That was surprising. Down over 30 million from last month. What happened there?
Well, that was a shocker. You're down 30 million from last month, and it was 17 million below the average guess. Now, the people who are in the business, they don't miss it by that much. They'll miss it sometimes, but I don't think in my entire career I've seen them miss it by 17 million.
Yeah.
And I can't figure out how that happened. We've had every month this crop year has been a record for that month. ever. And that was expected to again be the same story in April, and we missed it by 17 million. And, it was lower than last year's April number. And I have not yet seen a good explanation of how the trade missed that and what happened.
That's the surprising point. You haven't seen a whole lot of conversation about it. I'm continuing to wait to get some of these analysts and get some explanation about it. Another thing that needs a little explaining here, David, are some of the prices that we're seeing in both beef and pork. Explain to us again about the end of the week where July lean hogs dropped like $2 on Friday after being up fairly significantly over the last 10 days or so.
Yeah, at the beginning of the week, everybody was talking about cash hogs really moving higher. I thought, hey, we're going to go crazy with this thing. Well, no, we didn't. They've been selling off again. And I'll tell you, it's this old bugaboo that once you get into higher price territories, it becomes very, very volatile. And when you look at the market right now, you try and predict the future, you're in trouble because you're looking to the past to predict the future. The problem is the future has some other ideas in mind. And I'll tell you, if it looks like it's worth selling, sell it, folks.
There you go. Speaking of meat, apparently Cavanaugh's got a final word for us today. What are you talking about, John?
Well, I'm really worried. I have to admit, I'm really concerned. This is a major issue. I saw in the news this week where Kraft Heinz is talking about selling Oscar Mayer.
What? Tell me it's not true.
I hope it's not true, but I understand it's worth something in the vicinity of $3 to $5 billion. My goodness. For hot dogs? I mean, give me a break. I would never have imagined that. Although Oscar Mayer is a famous brand, it's a big brand, and I love the Wienermobile.
What is going to happen with the Wienermobile if this thing gets sold up?
I don't know. That's my concern. What's going to happen to the Wienermobile? It's an icon. It's one of the most fantastic marketing ideas I've ever seen. Everybody knows about the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile, so I'm really concerned about what's going to happen there.
I think it could be just a lot of baloney. Kohli and Cavanaugh, made possible each week by support from the Allen County Farm Bureau. Your local county farm bureau supports Indiana agriculture every day, from classroom programs for kids to political action that eliminated the state inheritance tax, and even more recently made an all-out effort to make sure most of the $860 million for Indiana broadband went to Hoosier farm families, the ones struggling with low or even no internet service. Support the Farm Bureau with a membership, and you'll get discounts on cars, computers, and even your next vacation. Go online to itpaystobeamember.org.
Podcasts by Federated Media.